something called BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Africa. We hope that this South Africa in BRICS is only a temporary thing, that BRICS will ultimately include all of Africa. And so in the midst of this crisis of capitalism, let me explain it very simply, because when I was on the radio this morning, my brother said I should break it down. What is the crisis of capitalism? The crisis of capitalism is when the forms of economic organization runs counter to the needs of the masses of the people, and you have massive unemployment, dislocation of people, closing of factories, and yet you have the capitalist class earning millions of dollars. And in this midst of the capitalist crisis, we have found that the capitalist class have competition among themselves. 80 years ago, we had such a crisis. It was called a global depression. And they attempted to solve that depression by invading Abyssinia. And my brother said I should explain to people what is Abyssinia. Abyssinia was the name of Ethiopia before it changed its name. So the invasion of Abyssinia in the midst of the last capitalist crisis, Africans responded and said, well, you know, what Mussolini, the fascist, is doing in Abyssinia, in Africa, is wrong. It is wrong to bomb and gas people, and they get away with it. We're going to have a catastrophe in the rest of the world. Europeans said, no, this is just Africans. We don't bother about these people. Let Mussolini do what he wants here. But after the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, we had the rise of fascism in Europe. Mussolini consolidated power with other fascists in Spain, in Portugal, and most spectacularly in Germany. And that fascism gave rise to war. And from that war, we had genocide, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and regression for humanity. And out of that, the African people organized to say we must end colonial rule. At the end of World War II, there was a division between those who fought together in the war. The United States and the Soviet Union allied to fight against fascism. And the United States, in fighting against fascism, aligned themselves with those who were in the German conservative forces to say our enemy is socialism. And we had a Cold War for nearly 50 years. In that Cold War, they developed an organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created ostensibly to provide for peace and for security among the alliance. And as was said by the Secretary General of NATO, it's a concert of democracies. Well, that's what it was supposed to be. There are the many histories of the Cold War. From the African point of view, we have to write our own history. Because the Cold War was not cold in Africa. It was very hot for Africans. Because every African leader who fought for independence was called a communist. Patrice Lumumba, Nelson Mandela, Samora Machel, Kwame Nkrumah. And so the Cold War was so our interpretation of NATO was very different because the Belgian colonialists were supported by NATO in dominating and exploiting the Congolese people. So that reckoning still has to come. Our universities, our institutions, our organizations still has to have an understanding of what was the impact of the Cold War on Africa. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed, it was the expectation that if an alliance was created for the purposes of fighting communism and you succeeded, then that organization should be wound up. And in many of us in the peace movement, those of us who are old enough, it was the expectation that we would have what we would call 20 years ago a peace dividend. That is, we would turn the production of weapons and tanks and jets into investing in schools, houses, hospitals, healthcare, and for reconstruction of the world. Instead, NATO expanded. NATO expanded and incorporated what was called the Mediterranean Union. We'll have to penetrate Mediterranean Union. It was a way of cutting off a number of states in North Africa, led by Morocco, and to include them into the defense alliance with Western Europe. For the defense of who? The Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. That's another part of global NATO. And of course, the part of global NATO that became the most activist was that these concert of democracies aligned themselves with the most conservative and feudal monarchs that were involved in something called the Gulf Cooperation Council. I need to tell you something about these people called the Gulf Cooperation Council. It involves political leaders in places such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And you do not have anything more anti-democratic in the world, anti-women, anti-human beings than these monarchs. So the elements of global NATO included those alliances from North America with Canada, and it expanded. And one of the most ignominious period of global NATO was the bombing of Kosovo for 79 days, which was a dress rehearsal for the bombing of Libya. Global NATO expanded to defend Western capitalism and to defend the interests of Western accumulation of the world. And what we saw in Libya was the experimentation of a new form of warfare by global NATO. This new form of warfare is a form of warfare where, because the peace movement in the United States is so strong, and the peace movement was opposed to the United States intervention in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And in fact, it was the peace movement that elected Barack Obama because they were so opposed to the intervention in Iraq. The Pentagon and the conservative forces in the Pentagon came up with a new form of warfare. It's a new form of warfare that involves military bombing by NATO, drone warfare, third country intervention such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia, private military contractors, and militias. And it's this new form of warfare that was being experimented with in Libya. But this experimentation had to find some justification. And the justification was in the form of responsibility to protect. It came in the form of what is called humanitarian intervention. The United States, of course, have created a military instrument for humanitarian intervention. It's called the United States Africa Command. Now, the peace movement all over the world, they're opposed to the United States Africa Command. Thankfully, because of the intensity of our protest and opposition to Africa, even the President of the United States no longer speaks of Africa. In fact, when the President of the United States visited Africa, he said, we want to reset the relationship with Africa. And the President of the United States now says, we want to talk about energy, electricity, education, and health. And so the militarization of the United States engagement with Africa, we want you to be assured that there are those of us in the United States who are opposed to the military engagement with Africa, and we want to have an engagement through United States universities, schools, hospitals, churches, mosques, and have an engagement of people-to-people relationship. So that we are asking you to raise your voices against the United States Africa Command, because we believe that within the present administration, there are elements of the administration that are opposed to the United States AFRICOM, just as we are opposed to AFRICOM. And we can discuss that even more. And I've written extensively. In fact, I'm writing a book. I was telling Solani about this book I'm writing called United States Militarism and African Independence. Because the United States militarism is not as extensive in Africa as some would want to think, because the United States have 80,000 troops in Europe. African opposition to the United States militarism means that it's very difficult for the United States to have troops in Africa. But why is it difficult for them to have troops in Africa? Because the recent history of the United States association with apartheid and with colonial elements means that one of the most important elements of the United States Africa Command is what they call the AFRICOM social science research. But social science in the United States of America faces opposition from those of us in the peace and justice movement, because there's a different social science of freedom from the social science of oppression. That's why I can mention my university, because you'll get both kinds of social sciences in our university, and that's part of the democratic struggles where we come from. Let's talk about the university and this idea of humanitarian intervention. As you know, no imperial power will intervene and say, we're going to come in to exploit you. When King Leopold and the Belgians entered Africa, they didn't come to say, we're going to come and plunder and kill 10 million people. Although the Belgians still teach their children that King Leopold was civilizing Africa. And I hope most of you have read the book by this great American writer, Adam Hochschild, King Leopold's Ghost, that where they killed 10 million Africans. So no imperial power will intervene to say they're intervening. Now, the imperial power, which has been the most nefarious and the most insistent on intervening in Africa, is the leadership of France. And my lecture is about Africa and the world. And capitalism in France and Europe, as you know, is facing such a severe crisis that the euro is on its knees. We have what they call the Eurozone crisis in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy. The French banking system is in a major crisis. And in all times of French economic and military crisis, the African people held them out. But there's a certain arrogance in France about who Africans are. If you remember when Sarkozy became president and he traveled to Africa, Sarkozy said that we are here to civilize Africans. So how can you have a humanitarian intervention in a place you do not consider Africans human beings? And so this is why African intellectuals have to be more robust. This idea of responsibility to protect was actually developed by Africans inside of the institutions of the United Nations because of our experience in Rwanda. Rwanda was a very dark day for Africa because many African leaders stood by while genocide took place. And Nelson Mandela, bless his heart, went to the OAU summit in Algiers and said, how is it that you Africans could stand here while other Africans are being massacred in Rwanda? And out of that experience of Mandela saying in South Africa and in Rwanda, never again, that African diplomats and intellectuals worked with other people to put on the agenda of the United Nations responsibility to protect, which superseded the sovereignty of states. That is, the international community had the responsibility to protect whenever there were threats to human life and genocide. Now, this responsibility to protect was put in the United Nations, and Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, gave them the excuse to be able to intervene in Libya when he called his people pigs and dogs. We'll have to discuss that later on. We'll have to discuss that. What Gaddafi said was wrong, and we should have condemned it. Because there was equivocation within the African Union about that. The French activists, Bernard Levin, manipulated what was happening in Benghazi to organize a United Nations resolution on the question of the impending massacre in Libya. Whew. Now we know that responsibility to protect is meaningless. You know, on August 14, they massacred nearly 1,000 people in Egypt. Where was they responsible to protect then? We have not seen 1,000 people massacred in Libya. So clearly this responsibility to protect is used by the former powers of the United Nations. I said former because Libya was the last time they could use it. They cannot use the United Nations now in the same way in Syria. So there was a resolution that was pushed through the United Nations. And we in Africa, in the peace community, we have to be self-critical about why is it we did not get behind the African Union roadmap for peace. And I say to students of international relations that we have to go back to that roadmap because it is going to happen again. So the resolution was pushed through. Okay. We accept. There's a United Nations resolution to protect the citizens of Libya because President Gaddafi and his son made statements that could be considered threats to the lives of people. Okay, we accept that. But the resolution 1973 was not a mandate for regime change in Libya. The resolution 1973 was stretched beyond the responsibility to protect for the intervention in Libya by NATO to seize the resources of Libya and to turn Libya into a base for Western destabilization of North Africa. And we've seen what has happened since then. So why Western intervention in Libya? What is so important about Libya? In this book that you see here, NATO's failure in Libya, Lessons for Africa, in this book we explain why Libya is so important. I'm reading a book on the plane here about the United States military. It's called The Generals. It's by Tom Riggs. And it talks about Tobruk and the importance of North Africa in World War II. And Eisenhower, who was a general, he was reporting to General Marshall, and they had to make a decision about when the United States got involved in World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Should the United States go to fight in the Philippines first, or they should fight in North Africa and Europe? And you'll know that the decision was made that to save Western capital and to save Europe and North America, they had to go and fight in North Africa first. So the North African campaign, from then and now, is important for Western sense of security. The political leadership of Libya emerged after nearly 50 years of colonial rule. One of the worst forms of colonialism by the fascists. There was never a place called Libya. Libya is part of that great part of Africa. And I tell you, when you meet people from the United States, if they ever come in your midst, tell them they should tell the State Department of the United States that there is no such thing called sub-Saharan Africa. We don't divide Africa between sub-Sahara and North Africa. And President Obama wants to respect Africa. He should tell the State Department that when he meets with the African Union represents all of Africa, not anything called sub-Saharan Africa. And so, in this space of North Africa, they had a king called King Idris, and they had a mandate from Britain to oversee Libya. At the end of colonialism, there was an upsurge of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism. It's important that we understand and remember these things because our children are being cut off from these things. We go into great details in the book, but it's important for us to remember it. Pan-Africanism was embraced by Nasser and the Egyptian military. It's not the Egyptian military that is killing the people in the streets today. This is just a passing phenomenon. I will explain that to you, that they will go. Because the Egyptians have a very proud history of the military, and they will not accept from within their ranks that their military will kill people like that. But Nasser embraced Pan-Africanism. We don't talk about Arab Spring. Because those who talk about Arab Spring is trying to take Egypt out of Africa.